Hey folks, this is Sean C. Fettig, host of Deep Dive. If you've caught our trailers over the past 6 months, you know we're gearing up for a limited series called After America. And if you haven't, make sure to give them a listen on the Deep Dive channel, which you can find on any podcast platform. How many times have you heard recently that American democracy is in danger, that the United States is on the brink of a precipice? Since the 2016 election and the destabilizing, horrifying events of January 6, 2021, it's become clear that the very foundations of American democracy are under threat. The future of the United States, were our democracy to fail, draws comparisons to Nazi Germany, but this is often dismissed as hysteria, and probably rightly so. But ignoring these signs could lead us into dangerous territory. So that begs the question, what would democratic erosion look like in today's United States? And that's the question After America aims to answer. So we've assembled a team of experts, people like Kate Starbird, who studies social media misinformation, Jason van Tatenhove, who has firsthand experience with militia groups in the United States, Stephen Marsh, who's written about the potential for another civil war, Monica Nalepa, who studies how democracies transition into and out of authoritarianism, David Gushee, an ex-evangelical who writes about the threat of Christian nationalism to democracy, Benjamin Carter-Hett, who researches and writes about the rise of Nazi Germany, Edward Watts, who examines the fall of Rome, and many more. They're all going to help us explore and understand how we got here, to January 6th, to the reconstitution of the facts surrounding that event, making heroes and martyrs of the insurrectionists, why nearly half of the country supports a return to office for the man responsible for that coup attempt, Donald Trump, what the future might hold were he to win and implement the policies he professes to support, and how, if at all, we can prevent a slide into authoritarianism. Join us for this groundbreaking series launching in late June. And in the meantime, in the run-up to the release of After America, we'll be revisiting past episodes of Deep Dive each Sunday between now and then that lay the groundwork for the vital conversations to come. Today, we're re-releasing my interview with Jason van Tatenhove, a former insider with the Oath Keepers militia who testified before the January 6th committee. And a side note, a funny thing about going back and listening to some of the earlier episodes of Deep Dive is realizing how far we've come with our audio and other elements of the show. I've tried to clean up some of this with the tools we now have, but there's still a rawness to it, and maybe that's appropriate to the content. Democracy is at a crossroads. The time to act is now. Keep checking back to Deep Dive on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to follow and like us for more updates about After America.
Their version of freedom is, great for them if you're a white Christian, far right fundamentalist. It works out real good. But if you deviate from that, if you're a woman who believes in reproductive rights, or you're a trans woman, or part of the queer community, that looks radically different living in that world.
Welcome to Deep Dive with me, Sean Fettig. I'm a political scientist, and I'm interested in trust, how our governments and politicians can gain our trust and how they lose it, but also how our personal stories can build trust and bind us together. So this space is dedicated to diving deeper into issues that are interesting, at least to me and hopefully to you, and that maybe we aren't always sure how to talk about. Today's episode is the second of a two-parter focusing on political violence and extremism in America. Last week, I spoke to Dr. James Hawden of Virginia Tech about the impact of extremism on our political institutions and the ability of those institutions to withstand such sustained attack, not just from fringe extremist groups, but also from fringe elements within the actual political and governing system. Today, I'm talking to Jason van Tatenhove, a former employee and self-described propagandist of the Oath Keepers, a right-wing militia organization, about their history, their objectives, and what we can expect next from these types of organizations. He has been a critical voice about organizations like the Oath Keepers in recent years, and has participated in numerous documentaries, including Hulu's homegrown Standoff to Rebellion. And in March of this year, Jason testified before the U.S. House Select Committee investigating the January 6th insurrection, which included some members of the Oath Keepers. First, though, some context here might help to follow the conversation. Jason references the Bundy standoff as his first real substantive work with the Oath Keepers, when he drove to the Nevada ranch with the Oath Keepers founder and leader, Stuart Rhodes. What I'm about to tell you is a simplified, digestible summary of events, but please recognize there is a bit more nuance and complexity to this story. So in a nutshell, the Bunkerville standoff occurred in 2014 after the Bundy family, primarily represented by rancher Cliven Bundy and his sons Ammon and Ryan, refused to remove their cattle from grazing on federal land in Nevada after the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM, established a protected space for an endangered desert tortoise. The Bundys argued that the states had sovereignty over land within their border, and that in fact the Bundys were sovereign citizens themselves, claiming that the federal government, thus, had no legal jurisdiction over the state land or the Bundys. On October 8, 2013, the United States District Court for the District of Nevada ruled, in United States v. Bundy, that the Bundys were trespassing on federal land and that they must remove their cattle within 45 days, or the Bureau of Land Management could impound the cattle. In early April of 2014, with the cattle still grazing on the land, the Bureau of Land Management began impounding the Bundy cattle. This led to what has become known as the Battle of Bunkerville, in which BLM agents faced off against armed protesters, including the Bundy family and private citizens and members of militia groups that had come from other parts of the country. After a tense standoff, the BLM agreed to suspend the roundup of cattle, but did not release the cattle they had already impounded. The Bundys continued to illegally graze their cattle on federal land. Ammon Bundy, Cliven's son, has gone on to participate in numerous other standoffs and occupations, including at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon in 2016. He's currently running for governor in Idaho. Jason, welcome. Thanks for chatting with me.
Sure.
Let's lay some historical context. Who are the Oath Keepers? What is the Oath Keepers? And then within that context, how did you become associated with them? What's the history there?
Sure. So the Oath Keepers, and you have to understand they've kind of evolved over time. So the Oath Keepers is known as an American extremist militia group that is, a lot of what they are tied to has its origin in conspiracy theory. They kind of came to prominence where, a lot more people knew about them during the Bundy Ranch standoff in the desert of Nevada, south of Las Vegas. So the way I kind of got hooked up into them is, I at that point was a independent journalist, kind of a do-it-yourself type guy. I had some podcasts and whatnot. And, I had written professionally before back in the early 90s for some local magazines and stuff. And I started seeing stories on national news, and, I had just moved up to Montana from Colorado. It was around Easter weekend when, it really started making prominence. I started looking into it and found some interviews on InfoWars, Alex Jones's outlet. And, there was this big kind of call out for good American patriots and militiamen and whatnot to go down to this tiny, old ranch in, tiny little town of Bunkerville, Nevada, south of Vegas there, and take a stand against the federal government. And, I've always kind of been the type of person who's drawn to big events, whether it's natural disasters or, civil unrest, whatnot. I've always been someone who's just kind of gone there, whether both, as a younger adult and then, later on as an adult doing it, covering it for news stories or, going to get the story or to go get pictures that I would intend to use in artwork. So I thought this was a really historic moment. And I had some connections into some Republican politics due to a kind of a social experiment I had done before I had left Colorado. So that I had gotten some contacts there, and I reached out to them and just saying, hey, have you heard of these guys? Have you heard of this thing going on down in Nevada? And kind of looking around for how I might be able to go get embedded in and do some stories. At the time, I was doing some broadcasts for Revolution Radio and, podcasts and whatnot. And sure enough, I started digging around, and by the end of the day, I got some calls from a guy, and he was handling a lot of the video and social media aspects for the Oath Keepers. And his name was Jim White. He had his own kind of do-it-yourself news outlet up in Northwest Montana called Northwest Liberty News. And by that evening, I had the okay to go ahead and go down with Stuart Rhodes embedded in his vehicle. And so I took the opportunity to go see what was going on. I really didn't have a lot going on at that point in time. I had just moved from Fort Collins, Colorado, up to the Butte, Montana area. And, I'd owned a tattoo shop previous to moving. So I just sold it and just wanted to get out of Colorado for a little bit. I'd pretty much grown up here from the time I was 10 or 12 and been there my whole life. So I really hadn't gotten many places, and decided, my oldest daughter was over 18 at this point, and my other two daughters I thought should get some different life experience. So we moved to Montana. And so when this opportunity came, I jumped on it. And I wound up driving up to Kalispell, which is actually right up on the Canadian border. But, it was a 3.5 hour trip up, and wound up meeting Stuart Rhodes there, and then traveling with him down south to Bunkerville. And I spent about 2 weeks with Stuart. And this was after, so that we had the Bundy Ranch is kind of broken into two periods of time. You have the initial setup when, you had like Ammon Bundy getting tased, and the BLM actually began rounding up cattle. They had between, I think, 150 and 300 heads of cattle rounded up. And then there was that big showdown, which was those iconic images that we see, like Eric Parker splayed out on the bridge overlooking the corral where the federal agents and the cows were being kept. And you had this kind of line of cowboys on horseback and, a bunch of people with flags converging on that. And there was actual guns pointed, from either direction. So that was kind of the big standoff day, the culmination. And I wasn't there for that. Stuart, after that happened, he went right back up to Montana to get more supplies and such, and bring in more people. And that's when I was able to kind of hook in. And so I went down there, spent the time. I did these, the radio cast for Revolution Radio, and, had kind of a bird's eye view. I was kind of right there with this group of people we had traveled down with. And so I went through that experience, and then he thought the coverage that I did was fair. And so he invited me up to the next one, which was it was a sugar pine mine incident up in Oregon. And it had to do with some miners that had a mineral rights dispute. So that was kind of the second of these events. And then the third, and they happened, a couple months after each other. And the White Hope mine happened real quickly after that. And it's at the White Hope mine that I actually got offered a position working there. And, I had gone up to Montana thinking I was going to open another tattoo shop, and that just didn't pan out with the way the economy was up there. So I really didn't have much else going on. I had done some part-time work as a livestock inspector, but when I went up to Lincoln, Montana, Stuart had asked for some help in just kind of proofreading and editing a press release that he was doing. I don't know if he did it purposely, maybe he did, but he wound up putting my name on the bottom along with the other people involved. And that, of course, got me a call from supervisors right away that, so I wound up resigning from that job and really didn't have anything then. And, I thought this could be the start of a possible book project, and accepted a job as an associate editor for their website. And the title he had put together was National Media Director. And it was my job to write articles covering events and things they were doing, and to go to these events when they did happen, and, film and take pictures and set up interviews for Stuart, and things like that. So, and I stayed with that job for about a year and a half, 2 years, before it got to the point where I just I couldn't do it, and walked away from everything. And, that had built because, what they had presented at the time and what they were evolving to were diverging more and more. They took a very hard right bent, with the rise of Richard Spencer and the alt-right. And really Stewart had found that it was these events and the reactions they got that really drove the direction of the Oath Keepers. You understand, the Oath Keepers is Stewart Rhodes. There is a board of directors and, different chapters and whatnot. But when it comes down to it, Stewart Rhodes is the one who was in charge of everything. And he had set things up that way from the beginning. And you understand, he is a Yale-educated attorney. He's a very smart guy in some ways. So yeah, that was kind of my job there. And, it lasted for a period of time. And then I've kind of been doing this self-imposed penance since, kind of speaking out about the dangers, because I do feel a certain amount of responsibility for, being a part of I was never a member, I was an employee, but, I do have to own it. And I do have to say, yes, I did write for them. And yes, I did do this work for them. And, for a period of time, I did get a little swept up in it. And so I've just got to own that. But, these days, and I think I kind of underestimated them. I never would have thought, just based on my impressions of things, that they would have made it to, being a key element of what transpired on January 6th at the Capitol. But they were. And, I guess I saw it more as a scam for, that Stewart had kind of put together a grift that allowed him to have this sense of power and finance a certain lifestyle. Not that it was a very grandiose lifestyle, but he's able to travel around all the time and, eat steak dinners at Applebee's every night. So, I had kind of dismissed it as, well, that's just Stewart doing his thing. But obviously I underestimated things a bit. And when we saw the bloodshed happen at Muller Refuge, I thought that was a real indicator. I think we've gotten really, really lucky because, the danger doesn't necessarily lie within Stewart Rhodes and the people like Stewart Rhodes. It really kind of is in these kind of outliers that are just so inspired, and they have very specific techniques that they employ, that they're finding hot button issues that have an emotional reaction, and that they're really pushing those, and tying themselves into that agenda. And they kind of look for these events to insert themselves into to gain more donations and gain more membership and keep the whole thing going.
So I'm glad you bring up January 6th, because there's a particular lens I want to look at this through. And I'm really interested in your feedback, which is, to most Americans, their introduction to organizations like Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, et cetera, is because of January 6th. And at that point, by that time, I think there was a broad brush that painted all the organizations essentially the same. That they all share the same common cause, they have the same beliefs, they all want the same things. Maybe at that point, to some degree, that may have been true.
Well,
right?
It's true depending on the circumstances. So these organizations are very quick to demonize each other and throw each other under the bus. And they're what I would term pissing matches that happen all the time amongst these different groups. One's always calling another a fed, or that they're not for real. But the second that, and a good example of this is, for a period of time when I was with the Oath Keepers, there was one of these periods of time where there's kind of that pissing match going on between Alex Jones and Stewart Rhodes. You'll notice there was a couple of years where neither was on either's media outlets and appearing on each other's shows and being guests and even talked about or mentioned. And it all stems back to a disagreement that happened there was a big gun rally at the Alamo. Someone's feelings got hurt, and it snowballed into this thing. But as soon as they saw this common theme where they could once again further each other's agendas. They were just best buds again. Stewart was on InfoWars leading up to what those events that happened on the 6th. And, I got to preface this, and I prefaced it with, the congressional investigators when I talked with them, because they had asked me to come give a historical precedence background on kind of the Oath Keepers. I've been away out of this game for, a while, many years. And my small sliver of what I saw firsthand that I can speak on was during that period of time. And I kind of washed my hands, other than, now that I've got the book deal and stuff, I'm revisiting all of it. But for a long time, I just wanted it out of my mind, out of my head. I wanted to put some good karma in the well and just move on. So, but talking from a historical precedence, yeah, they will align, and it's happened with the Proud Boys, when you looked at some of the events that happened with the Patriot prayer groups, in the Seattle area in Portland, where Stewart would come in and say he was going to provide security. And I think the Proud Boys are more true believers. Like, they want to go engage in violence. They want to bring that violence to the streets, whereas Stewart wants to project the optics of being that tip of the spear and, the brawlers that are willing to take care of business. But you'll notice Stewart is always right behind the line where he's going to get in trouble and towing it, very closely. So I think that kind of set the tone for the relationship, because the Proud Boys are able to see kind of the true Stewart when at these events. And, they aligned again. Obviously, we saw that they were meeting in the parking structure from the releases from the court thing. And, there was communication going on there. But again, it was when it could both benefit both groups.
So this is an interesting point to me, and one I wouldn't otherwise have known, which is that, these tensions exist between and across the groups, and that, January 6th was, a convergence point wherein, all of these groups could share this common cause. I think that misrepresentation, but what I think most of us see this through, is that all of these groups have the same objective and they coalesce. That in and of itself is scary. But I think what you're saying is actually a bit more scary, because assuming this had worked on January 6th, now we're faced with a whole bunch of groups clamoring for power that don't actually share the same objective. What is the end game then?
And that's kind of eye-opening too, because for a period of time, I don't know if you're familiar with a gentleman called Ernie Tertelget. He is the model for when law enforcement is training on the sovereign citizen movement. He is also known as the Montana Natural Man. If you just YouTube him, you can find all kinds of stuff. Well, he actually wound up being my next door neighbor, because where I lived up in Eureka, when I was working for the Oath Keepers, I was living on, property of Oath Keeper supporters. And it was kind of a who's who of kind of that realm. And my eyes really opened when I did a series of interviews with Ernie, just talking about, all right, well, what are your views? Because you've got all this crazy legal, gibberish that really doesn't make sense to people. And I think that it is intended not really to make sense to the average person, and legal professionals. That, okay, so what is it you want to get to? And really it wants to get to anarchy. At least with what Ernie was saying in the sovereign citizen movement, as far as like Proud Boys and Oath Keepers or the 3%ers, I think we're seeing that now in Idaho and Texas, where it's just a cultural divide, where their version of freedom is, great for them if you're a white Christian, far right fundamentalist. It works out real good. But if you deviate from that, if you're a woman who believes in reproductive rights, or you're a trans woman, or, part of the queer community, that looks radically different living in that world. And so I think, there's a spectrum of it. You have people like Ernie who want to see anarchy and no law, and, anarchy where everyone's going to just behave and respect each other's rights. But I don't think human nature is really we're not ready for anarchy, true political anarchy. And don't get me wrong, I've had a lot of anarchist yearnings in the past. I would consider myself an extreme centrist these days. And, so you have that, and then you have kind of this misogynistic, alpha male dominated culture that the Proud Boys would want to see. And then, with someone like Stewart, it's having the authenticity, the being seen as legitimate, as some sort of paramilitary folk leader who, helped to restore the country to a mythology of what it may have one day been in his eyes, with a president that, sees and acknowledges that and accepts his help, his offer for help. Stewart was always trying to go around the country offering, like the county clerk who wasn't officiating the gay marriages, offered to provide her security. He's always offering to provide security for people, the recruiting centers when that happened, that's just part of his MO. And he was always being turned down. I mean, it was rare that it was accepted. So I think he, part of it is being seen as this legitimate, patriot version of a freedom fighter leader, and coming to power and respect and recognition through that.
So I have two things I want to talk about, and one of them is Trump, but I want to put a pin in it. So if I forget, let's swing back to this.
Okay.
But first, so anarchy in and of itself is like a governing theory, right? I mean, it's kind of like an anti-governing theory.
Yeah, that everyone has personal responsibility to respect property rights and everything else.
It doesn't feel like at the end of the day, let's say, this is at least a professed, objective or goal for these organizations. It doesn't feel like that's the case. And I hear that between the lines of what you're saying, which is, it seems to me like what is actually happening is they want to remove the guardrails that keep them in line from pursuing the world they want, which is, to eradicate the world of people they don't like, or at least be able to physically and abusively keep them in line. And right now, the government is stopping them from doing that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And that's very much it. They want their worldview and their community, and that's it. They want the freedom to do what they want to do, but they don't want to afford real freedom to other people within that community. And that's what's scary about, some of these people, these icons of the community who are now running in state legislator. Ammon Bundy's running for governor right now. And they're finding new ways to gain momentum with, we saw this with the Ammon Bundy's group during the COVID lockdowns with the mask mandates and, rebelling against that, getting arrested in the state capitol. And, these groups look at what's working for one group and they will employ similar tactics for their own aims.
It's an interesting and scary thing.
I think there's a whole lot of things that, they proclaim to be, but really is not the case, and that can be pretty easily illustrated with, say, Stewart. And, he, for the longest time, proclaimed not to be racist. And he would point to I believe it was his mother or his grandmother, who he would tell the story had come over, across the Mexican border to work in the agricultural industry of Southern California. And yet here he is offering to provide security, and quite poorly, I might add, because the day that Richard Spencer got punched in the face was the day that Stewart and the Oath Keepers were doing security. But and I don't think Stewart at heart is a racist person. I think he just has his finger on the pulse of his audience and caters to where they're going to, whether that be through conspiracy theory. I think conspiracy theory and what is hot within, the conspiracy theories of that particular culture is really what they gravitate to. It really kind of is a major driver in that area.
Well, that makes me wonder then, though, like how much of this is how much of this is a genuine ideological disposition and, like a set value set versus playing to, dollars and visibility.
I would argue that the vast majority of it is playing towards dollars and visibility. And that comes from my day-to-day work that I was doing, where, part of our job was to go see what was happening out there, in those echo chambers, in social media and on the news and news outlets and whatnot, and try to find those stories that were really kind of going viral, and craft our own version of that story that served Stewart's aims and purposes.
So let's swing back to Donald Trump. And I don't want to oversimplify this, but I kind of have to, which is there have been extremist groups on the right and the left for time immemorial. And there's always been some other missing piece that didn't allow coalescing to the point of boiling over. And where I'm going with this is I have this thought, which is that Donald Trump, in the position he was in, so the presidency, which afforded him an immense amount of power, provided the bridge puzzle piece that was missing.
Absolutely. And went in further. The Trump administration, according to stories that I've been told, was actively reaching out to these militia communities. This happened through Roger Stone, who was setting up meetings. So during this candidacy, there was a guy running down in Nevada, running for an office there, and he was a brothel owner. And so Roger Stone came down to talk with them, but they went off to this. It was like a Christian retreat ranch area, and they were having water rights issues. So they were talking about doing a standoff there, but there was a gathering of people within the community, and I actually got invited to it, that were going there specifically to meet and just talk with Roger Stone, and no one really knew why. And I think we see kind of the fruition to that, and that was right at the end of everything. So I was done already. But it's very surprising to see that they were reaching out to the militia community, and who was providing security for Roger Stone, on the day of the 6th and the day previous to that, it was the Oath Keepers. So I think he probably did make some inroads in, and I'm interested to see what we discover with the legal proceedings moving forward, to see how much that may have tied into things, as far as opening lines of communication. But yeah, Stewart was just waiting for that type of opportunity, and I think he really kind of got it with the Trump administration.
You know what I find somewhat fascinating? I mean, I guess maybe it's not uncommon, especially with kind of demagogues, is this, Trump made a lot of promises about putting skin in the game, and some examples are, I'm going to walk with you to the Capitol.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, these guys seem to be cut from the same cloth. I mean, Stewart, again, he was there, he was calling for people to show up and donations, and was purchasing equipment all along the way, and had people there, and we saw that wedge formation, stack formation going up the Capitols that have become iconic. And yet, where was Stewart? He was never in the Capitol. He was right on the edge. They didn't get him for the trespassing; they got him for the conspiracy. Trump's the same way. Like the MO is to use an emotional touchstone to get people just worked up, and then get them to do the stupid things.
Right. Well, and that's where I'm going is
walk into the White House.
Right. And I mean, also even campaigning, if you get into scuffles, I'll pay your legal bills. And that never happened. Right.
And Stewart, that's a long tradition with. Actually, he was disbarred from the Montana Bar Association because he had a string of clients and part of his soapbox speech when he was calling for donations and calling for people to go out and do these things was, if we're going to help pay you to get there and stay and feed you while you're here and make sure you get home. And if there's trouble, if you get if something happens, I'm a Yale-educated attorney and I'll take care of you. And he abandoned so many people that they disbarred him. That's why they disbarred him. And Jerry DeLamus is a perfect example of this. He's someone who came out from the East Coast, was later arrested for the Bundy Ranch standoff. He was an Oath Keeper. He went on behalf of the Oath Keepers. And, you know, his wife was then a state legislator back where they came from. I think it was like Delaware, somewhere in New England. I remember fielding calls for Stewart with him in the, you know, I would be driving with him and we'd get a call and it would be Susan DeLamus just in tears begging Stewart to help. And of course he would tell her he's going to do all these things, but he never did. He never did it with anyone. He never helped a single person that he inspired to go and you know, take these stands, that he you know, use that emotion to whip them up. And that's an ongoing pattern that has been there from the start. And you know, we saw the same thing with you know, kind of a microcosm, macrocosm with the Trump administration.
I mean, not to put a too fine a point on it, but it does seem surprising that they could make such fools out of so many people time and time again.
Yeah. I mean, and again, it doesn't matter. People are in these echo chambers, and you know, the more, you know, a legitimate journalist will come through and question and call things out, the more that this echo chamber group would just see it as, oh, well, that's the mainstream media with fake news. They're just setting them up. They're just, you know, it just fed to this kind of folk hero mythology that just was, you know, the furthest thing from the truth.
I guess that begs the question, or all of this begs the question of, like, with this landscape, right? So these organizations have proliferated. They've been able to recruit at a much higher rate than prior to, let's just say, the Trump administration. But Trump is not going anywhere. You know, he's talking about running for office again.
Yeah, and the scary part is he's talking about pardoning everyone.
Right. Which, I mean, I would imagine further emboldens folks. So
well, you have this kind of weird cycle that happens. So when you get a very right-wing person, so within these communities, you know, part of the barometer of where we are culturally is look at the sales of things like survival food and, you know, kind of preparing for this big battle between the federal government and good Americans that has become part of this mythology. You know, when you had Hillary Clinton in office and you know, if it's a left person, business is really, really good. I know people that have made just a ton of money. You know, the same sort of model with InfoWars, and Alex Jones does, you know, vitamin supplements and storable food and ammunition companies, and, you know, they're making a lot of money. But when Trump comes in, that dies out. It kind of flatlines, right? It wasn't until, you know, the election where Trump was going to kind of, you know, have his presidency, quote unquote, stolen, that things really got crazy, because we kind of had a lull there. And, you know, it's kind of this pendulum that swings back and forth depending on who's in office. And it's, you know, every time it's becoming a more and more extreme reaction. And that's also part of what really scares me, along with what happens like on either end. Because, you know, if Trump gets elected, that's a whole nother set of scary things to worry about than if he doesn't and Stewart gets put in jail and these people get put in jail, and now we have a power vacuum, and who knows what's going to rise up to fill that void. You know, if history is any sort of cue, you know, things are ratcheting up each time. It's becoming more extreme each time, each cycle. And, you know, where does that eventually lead?
Well, I mean, that actually leads to my next question. And I guess I'm going to ask you to prognosticate, you know, as best you can. But where is all this going? What can we expect the next few years from these organizations?
I think they're going to become more and more ingrained into local politics. I think that that's going to give a certain amount of legitimacy to the groups surrounding them. and that's going to embolden them. I think the only way, and I've been talking with a lot of people about this. I've been talking with people over at Georgetown Law, Mary McCord, some kind of nonprofit think tanks, and then documentarians. I had actually a discussion with a gentleman who's putting together a Netflix documentary he wants me to be in. That how do we get off this track? How do we fix this? And it's got to start with employing some of the same techniques that we've seen the extremists use, and that is storytelling, good, heart touching, emotional touching storytelling, where we can humanize, because we've come to this point where the right and the left have dehumanized each other so much that they're not even really seeing them as human anymore. It's those Antifa leftists, troublemakers, or communist bloc representatives. And God, I got to say, the right now is kind of schizophrenic with communism, because there's a segment that really likes Putin and this whole big man authoritarianism kick, and those that communism is awful. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a certain amount of soul searching that needs to happen there. But I think the only way we do this, the best way we have to change a culture, we just seem to be wired for storytelling. That to a certain extent has been well weaponized, and I think we need to reclaim that and do it. Use it as a balm, use it as a healing agent. That we've got to actually open some dialogue, some conversations, between family members, starting family members that have diverging political beliefs. We've got to start talking to one another as human beings, and listen to each other. There's this huge divide right now between rural and urban America, and that divide started from very real things. If you look back in the history of what really kicked off Bundy Ranch, it had to do with certain legislation that was passed for the Mojave Desert tortoise, and the effects those well-intentioned endangerment regulations that were enacted really didn't take a look at the bigger picture. And 10 years before the Bundy Ranch standoff, the Bundys had 50 other farming families that were their neighbors. And by the time Bundy Ranch happened, Cliven was the last man standing. He was the last cattle rancher there. And, that all ties back to a urban development project that Clark County wanted to push forward. And in exchange for getting this from the government agency that gave those permits with the tortoise, because they knew that this urban development was going to have a negative effect. So they, in fact, this is actually coming from Reuters, they made a deal with them saying, we're going to try to buy out every rancher there is and get the cattle off of, the public lands there. And so they were trying to say that, look, this is having an impact on the way we make a living and the way our family has made a living for generations. But they felt it really landed on deaf ears, and everyone was pushed out. We've got to look at our approaches with government regulation and really listen to what the impact of that rural community is really having, because it does have major effects. We got to start there. Otherwise, we're going to continue to have this kind of battle happening. So that's the best I can come up with is it starts with conversations. And I think those conversations can be spurred through good storytelling.
Given the fact that most of these organizations, if not all, are pretty resistant to government, is there a role for government in this? And if not, then how do we promote this idea of storytelling as a balm?
I think we got to decide as a community of creatives, of smart individuals living it right here and now, to think, all right, instead of just, becoming further divided and fall further into this kind of tribalism, that we need to start really thinking outside of the box, because what we've been doing hasn't been working. So we got to try something else. I don't know where the government would be in that. I mean, I'm sure, I mean, they've got to have a seat at the table too, for this to work all the way around. So, I don't know what that answer is really. I just know that what we've been doing has led us to where we are now. And we have to not just look at these flashpoints that are happening, the optics of the news, when the riots are happening, and the guns are pointed at each other. We've got to go back and look at what brought us there and why people have gotten to a point where someone like Stuart Rhodes can come and tap into that emotional reaction and make it even worse.
So let's make this a little more personal then, because I could imagine someone in your position, like I think I agree with you. You said this earlier, like you're not wanting to relive some of that history, but also there's a kind of a value in documenting that and, being aware of that. But also I could imagine, especially for someone like you that identifies as a creative, as this is not the balm for you per se, that a better use of your time, and I'm putting words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, a better use of your time would be to pivot to those creative outlets that you have to start to create that, what you call, this balm.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you're doing that and what that looks like.
No, I am, and if you look at, so I got back into writing when I moved back to Colorado about 4 years ago. I started just kind of covering things on my own and doing kind of politically motivated artwork, which I've shown in galleries down in Denver. I did a whole series that showed at Bit Factory that used just Colorado-based trans models to start doing conversations there. I've created some pieces around the treatment of J-1 visa workers here in Estes Park, Colorado. And just, the stories. And then I got a job writing for the local newspaper, which is owned by, the same company that owns Denver Post and, Alden Global Media. But I worked for about a year and a half as a staff reporter here in Estes Park. And, just the types of stories I was writing, that was kind of gearing up for this. And I knew that, I'd have a story, my story would have some relevance anyway, as things progressed. And then when the Capitol insurrection happened, just before that happened, I'd interviewed a gal who is a New York Times bestseller and owns a agency that happens to be local here, and was telling her about some of my stories. And she was like, you need to start telling these. And I had also, for the last several years, been working behind the scenes with some very large stories about that segment, but I was doing it as an unnamed source. It was, I've been contacted by documentary. I mean, I get a new documentary film crew contacting me every other week. And, there are talks now about producing and working on some series. I've been contacted by some pretty big names. But, I always want to tell my story in my own voice, my own words. And I just needed to be ready to do that. And so me and my agent decided to start pitching this book around. And I really had no interest until I started using my name, because my agent was like, look, you got to start using your names. You can't do this, from behind the scenes anymore. If we want to do this and really have the impact. And so I started off with a Washington Post article that came out. It was November, before the Capitol insurrection. It's the first time I used my name with one of these kind of top shelf journalists that I had been working with behind the scenes for years. And that led to the Hulu documentary and led to the Nightline appearances. A clip of them made it on Good Morning America. A lot of press coverage. And of course, that press coverage led directly to having the congressional investigators having a voicemail to me 6:30 next morning. Going and telling my story to the congressional investigators, just figuring out all right. So if I'm going to do this, if there's value to what I can do here, what's the best way to do that? And that's kind of how I hooked in. I'm going to be doing a series of speaking events starting in August with Georgetown Law. Me and Mary McCord, who's kind of heading up Georgetown Law's constitutional side of things there, and these types of projects. And she's the one who's kind of plugging me into, these these nonprofit think tanks trying to figure out, all right, so how do we do better? How do we start working on this problem? And so it's going to start in Milwaukee. I'll be doing a dinner talk for, local state legislators and law enforcement leadership and, DAs and such. And that's going to start in Milwaukee, and then it's going to go to like Maine and Pennsylvania and stuff. So we're starting there. There's been talk of I've had documentary film producers and directors and producers, begin to reach out to me to talk about different subjects around kind of in the peripheral of that. And as of this morning, and then talk of me actually helping to produce and direct a documentary of my own tackling these subjects. So, it's evolving. And I also, I've got my own gigs going on. I've got a little news outlet that's for local news here in Estes Park, Colorado, and regionally across northern Colorado called the Colorado Switchblade, and a podcast that I do with that. And the book is going to be coming out, but we got to kind of see, because there's talk that I may be a bigger part of the, once we move from investigation to an actual court case, I may be called upon by Congress to give my experiences and thoughts there. So it's kind of just exploded since I put my name out there in the public sphere and kind of came out with, well, this is my story and this is how I feel about things. So we'll see. It's just now beginning to take shape and evolve. And part of me didn't really feel like there was much value in my story. I mean, I had a small sliver of this experience and came in as an outsider and then plugged in and got swept away a little bit and then, broke away before things really got crazy. It was before Charlottesville happened and, things kind of took that more of a violent, feel, if you can say that, coming from armed government standoffs. It's unfolding in its own time, but yes, more and more people are showing me that there is value to me speaking out. And, if that can be part of my own personal penance, then that's what I'm going to do.
I have this fear that we, at least in the United States, have kind of lost the value in concepts like forgiveness and redemption. And I think that's dangerous because they offer off-ramps for people, like opportunities for...
How do we move forward in a productive way without that?
Right. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this and how you've navigated this in your experience.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I did feel like, my daughters are just like the center of my life. And I found ways to support our family while being at home so I can take care of them. My wife is medically disabled, so I now have an opportunity where, I've got to show them through my own life how to be successful in life and how to try to live with a moral compass. They were right there with me with a lot of this stuff and going to court hearings and such with them and the coverage that I was doing back in the day. I'd bring my daughter with me. I'd bring my middle daughter, but she's my oldest daughter is quite a bit older. So they've always been a part of my life's journey since they've been here. And it's my job to help teach them. And I've got to show them it's okay to, get swept up and be associated with this type of thing. But you got to go try to do something to make up for it. You got to try to better the world. And I feel bad already for the world that they're going to be inheriting from us, that, there's all this craziness going on all around the world. And the craziness here, I was actually in the middle of that mix to a certain extent. So I've got to show them that, that you can come back from that and you can try to make a difference. And the important part is trying, who knows if there'll be any differences made. We may just spiral and crash and burn, but I can't just, if there's something I can do to try to help, then I do have to do it because I've got to show them and I've got to try to make the world better for them.
One more question for you. What have you been reading or watching lately that's been particularly interesting to you lately? And it doesn't have to even be related to what we're talking about.
Yeah. I've been watching, I wrote an article about it actually, and I did a podcast on an article about it. And I included my oldest daughter for kind of a younger view on this, but the climate change issue for me has been huge. We live here in Estes Park. Literally, just this morning, they took down the mandatory evacuations for a wildfire 5 miles out of town. The beginning of winter, there was the Kruger Rock fire right on the east side of town. Last summer, we were evacuated twice for the Cameron Peak fire, which was the largest fire in our state history here in Colorado, and then also for the Troublesome fire, which came over the other side of the park. And we also have had, several major floods in recent history. So being up in the mountains right next to Rocky Mountain National Park, climate change is very apparent here because we're in a land of extremes. And so those extremes get exacerbated with this climate change. And so, that had a profound effect on me. Now the premise isn't, it is climate change, but they're doing it as a satire piece about a comet or meteorite coming to hit. But it's just so poignant in reactions of people when there's this big, immediate, desperate need that we have this, dissonant cognitive effect happening where, we're too tied up in escaping to our social media and the lives that we're living that we don't see the world burning down around us. That's something that I've been watching recently that has a profound impact. Reading, I've been going back over, well, first off, I read a lot of Stephen King. So I was reading his newest novel. And the fiction I write is like supernatural horror fiction. That's kind of, it's following an old, beat up punk rock journalist in Colorado. And it's set like the first novel set during the wildfires of last year and also deals with the treatment of the J-1 visa workers during the pandemic lockdown. Mm-hmm. So, I wrap in my fiction stories, I wrap a little, seed of truth to try to spur some conversations. And then the other thing I've been reading a lot, I've just been going through like the columns of Hunter S. Thompson. Mm-hmm. I've been working my way through his entire omnibus.
Well, I really enjoyed this. I'm glad that you took the time to have a conversation with me.
No, it was good.
After these two interviews, Dr. Hawden last week and Jason this week, I'm particularly struck by a few things, and to be honest, at least in the short term, I'm not super hopeful. One, these organizations have an ideology for sure, but that ideology is malleable and often changes based on the strength of a revenue stream or how much attention they get. This makes it particularly difficult to understand what they want and to then even begin to address their grievance. Two, how leaders of these organizations, and including people like Donald Trump, use their followers, their membership as useful idiots in pursuing their own personal goals, promising some glory, money, and protection in exchange for loyalty, and often asking or expecting their members to put themselves in physically dangerous or legally tenuous situations that they themselves avoid. There's no dignity, no honor in that. It's just exploitation and abuse. And finally, the danger to the Republic, to the Union, as these fringe organizations have been embraced by, in fact, are themselves political elites, politicians that have ceded our American seat of democracy, our institutions, our chambers of law and policymaking. They are now inside the house they want to burn down. This is chilling. And I also agree with Jason's suggestion that sharing our stories, reconnecting with each other, as Americans, as humans, is a critical component of beginning to at least rebuild a bridge between our families and our communities. All right, so it has not escaped me that I've been neglecting Pride Month, and I've brought you a few heavy episodes. So next week, in recognition of Pride Month, I'm bringing you 2 episodes. On Monday, June 27th, I'm going to bring the temperature down a bit when I'll be talking to my buddy, Duncan Tucker, the writer and director of the movie Transamerica. We'll talk about a bunch of things, but I really focus on how such a small, independent film with somewhat controversial subject matter for the time became a critical darling that carried 2 Oscar nominations. And on Friday, July 1st, I'm talking to Marty Moore, the executive director of Out Boulder County, about the advocacy and support work they do and the state of queer rights in the United States today. In the meantime, as always, if you have any thoughts, questions, or comments, you can email me at deepdive1 deepdivewithsean@gmail.com. And you can find me on Twitter at deepdivesean and on Instagram at deepdivewithsean. Chat soon, folks.